This week's Torah portion, Bo, continues from the end of last week's portion with God bringing upon the people of Egypt 10 different plagues. God wanted to get the attention of Pharaoh and to demonstrate to him and to the people that he was the supreme God, that they served false gods. So, some have theorized that each plague is a direct attack on a false god of the Egyptians. Firstly, turning the Nile into blood was to demonstrate God's superiority over the gods associated with the Nile. Smiting the land with frogs was to symbolically spite an Egyptian frog fertility goddess. God made the dust of the earth turn into gnats to spite Egypt's earth god. God sent swarms of insects to spite Egypt's fly god. God brought a severe pestilence which killed the Egyptians' cattle, which was in order to spite the Egyptian gods associated with bulls and cows. God also sent boils upon both people and animals, and this was to spite the Egyptian god of healing. God then sent a very heavy hail upon Egypt, and this was to spite Egypt's sky god and their gods of agriculture. God then sent locusts, and this was to spite the god the Egyptians worshipped in order to protect them from locusts. God then sent a severe darkness upon the land, and this was to spite the famous Egyptian sun gods. And yet, after all of these plagues, despite all of the horrific consequences, Pharaoh did not release the people of Israel. However, God lastly sent the worst plague of all, the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians. And this plague was likely a demonstration of God's judgment over the Egyptians and Pharaoh in particular. And to ensure that they themselves would not be included in this judgment, the people of Israel were instructed to take an unblemished lamb, slaughter it, and, quote, take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. Why put blood on the doorposts? It says in verse 23 of chapter 12, for the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. So the blood of the unblemished lamb on the doorposts of the house allowed God's judgment to pass over those in the house. And this protection that the blood afforded the Israelites should resonate with all Christians. Indeed, isn't it true that salvation is waiting for anyone who is willing to apply the blood of the Lamb to the doorposts of their heart? As Paul said in 1 Corinthians, Christ, our Passover, has also been sacrificed. Unlike his response after each of the other plagues, this time Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron at night and said, rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said. So, under God's guidance, Moses led the people out. However, in chapter 14, Pharaoh regretted letting the people of Israel go, so he sent his army after them. Now, the people were facing the Red Sea and having nowhere to go. The people were understandably afraid. But Moses said, do not fear, stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. And God miraculously parted the sea for Moses and the Israelites, and they made it safely to the other side. And when the Egyptians attempted to follow them, the water returned to normal and drowned them. God had done a mighty work for the Israelites, and their exodus from Egypt was memorialized in the yearly festivals of Passover and unleavened bread. And the most important aspect of Passover is the Seder meal, which itself is a way to obey the commandment given in chapter 13. You shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. It is the duty of each and every believer to pass on to the next generation the stories of what God has done for his people historically and for what God has done for them personally. And the story of the Exodus and the Passover greatly inform the overall narrative of the Bible because it's the story of the first great redemption of God's people. A story that shows us what it looks like when God saves his people. The story of God's deliverance of his people from Egypt shows us that God is willing to meet us where we're at and bring us out from darkness. And again, this story shows us that God saves us through an appointed Redeemer. After this first redemption, it says this of the people of God: "When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses." However, as much as we revere Moses, it's actually not he that ultimately deserves to be coupled with the Lord in this way. Instead, it is Jesus the Messiah, who is our way to God. Jesus said, "Believe in God, believe also in me." Jesus is the final Redeemer, the one who leads us out of the Egypt of sin and death and brings us into the promised land of the coming kingdom.